Any questions?
I think I have the first question. You talked about using test data. The reason why we kind of have you here today is we're looking at implementing a customer health check that TAMs can do. And so we want to run this, the GPT, against a customer instance. So talking about test data, is it okay to use their real world data? I guess is part one.
Not really. That's the
Okay.
answer. No. The problem is that performance testing is so everything needs to be, you know, trying to figure the right way to put this. Everything needs to be in a line, in a row, in terms of the setup from start to finish. Everything I've described has to be set up in exactly the same way as much as possible, or else the scenario has changed, or the test conditions, you can call it, has changed. So that means the results will change. They might, for example, if you test against real data, they might have 10,000 more issues than what our test kind of tool has been set up to take. And that's fine. The test tool will still test against it, but it will report a slower result. That's something we're still figuring out the best way to tackle in the future. We mentioned one of the slides that we try and design the test there to be realistic but large. But there will always be extreme outliers in the real world. And that's in itself is still a problem. No customer should be seeing bad performance really. So that's just a situation that we need to figure out in the future. But you can still run it against real data. But what we do say in the docs is that we still like a run against our own test data so we can compare, if you get what I mean. Because running it against their test data just tells us that their test data might be slow. Whereas we need our own run to tell us how the environment is actually performing.
I see what you're saying, because you want an apples to apples comparison.
Yep.
But I think folks are definitely going to want, at least for our health check, they're going to want to run this against their real data, just to see maybe where there are problems. But as long as we know that using real world data might skew the results slightly, I think this could still be useful for customers.
It can still be used, and we do give a guidance on how to run the GPT with custom data, with not the standard data. But as I say, if you wanted to come to us and ask why is this environment performing so badly, that's fine. We're more than happy to discuss about it. But then my first ask would be to run it against our data so we can have that baseline. And
That's
then we
fair.
can extrapolate on it. Because then if they're seeing like really bad performance, for example, and then you run it against our test data, and our test data shows the same bad performance extrapolated, then at least then we can have that kind of baseline of, okay, the environment's not actually spec'd well enough, or there's something else happening with the environment to slow it down for some reason.
Okay, cool. And there was sort of a follow-up question from Jamie about we shouldn't be testing against production because of the load it's going to put on the server.
We don't test against production. That's another rule.
Yeah, I sort of asked that tongue in cheek, but I guess I was curious for the group's reaction to that, because like for a company that's like serving GitLab on Metal that maybe doesn't have the ability to sort of spin up like an analogous sort of production-esque instance in a staging environment. I think most of my customers do, so it's probably a moot point.
I mean, yeah, the general process would be to test against a staging or another environment, or if customers are just doing it as a one and done to build the environment, they can also run it before they go live. If it's the case that they only have one environment and they're adamant that's the case, then it would be possible probably to run it against an environment that would be in downtime or a quiet time maybe, where people
Yeah, that's
are
what I
aware
was.
that, hey, there's going to be a performance test running today, you might see some slowdown.
Right.
But yeah, generally that's the least recommended the bunch, but I guess
Okay.
it's possible. But yeah, and in our world, we absolutely do not test against production. No way.
Like I can envision a scenario where like we've exhausted all other options and we suspect some kind of flaky hardware problem or something. Hopefully a problem that's well behind us in the age of cloud native, right? But I could see a scenario where you might tell a customer like, hey, book a, like you say, quiet time, like a change outage type thing,
Yeah.
2 a.m. and run this test. And while it's not ideal, at least it's something of a controlled scenario where you can be relatively assured nothing's happening in the instance and nobody else is depending upon that instance to be performant, let's say.
Yeah, as long as everyone is aware, they can still use the instance. It probably, in our experience, it probably will still work. But obviously, in the real world, you never know what different environments are out there. So it's just an awareness thing. but yeah, that'd be fine. The thing I didn't call out this because it's not directly related with GPT is the metrics. That's something that we do a lot as well, is measuring the metrics of an environment that has its tests run against it. When debugging an environment, that would be it's usually one of the more important parts of it. You run GPT to actually stress the environment, then you actually look at the environment's behavior, its performance. I'll show this quickly here. This is our 10K environment, our 10K reference architecture. This was a full test run earlier today. And this is just a dashboard we've made of the inbuilt Grafana and Prometheus that comes with GitLab. And this is obviously showing CPU memory, and we also have various other stats and everything else. But every customer has different monitoring kind of solutions. But this would be certainly, this is where we go next. If we run tests and the tests are running badly, this would be the next thing we want to look at, is how's the actual boxes performing.
Cool. Thanks, Grant.
No problem at all.
I see, Brian, you had a follow-up question to John's original question here.
Yeah, and if I missed this, apologies. I'm trying to understand if we need to set up an environment that is completely separate, or I hate to use the word destructive testing, right? But there's some contamination of the alteration of the test environment under test, and so we should keep that separate. I'm still on my first cup of coffee. So, Jamie, if you want to translate for me, sorry.
How about I read my next question, actually?
There we go.
Because hold on, I think the question you're looking for is exactly what I've written, which is the GPT tool designed to be used against real-world customer instances? I.e., is it going to cause, or could it potentially cause data loss? Is it going to clean up after itself?
Brilliant.
Thank you. Or is it designed to be used identically against identically configured production-like instances purely for the test, and then cleaned up afterwards?
So the generation of data is a separate script, and we did that intentionally. The data that it generates will all get put into its own group, and it's designed to be separated from the rest. And then the idea is that for a customer, they can then come in and just delete the top group and walk away. Everything's happy. GPT itself, the vast majority of tests are only doing safe requests, gets, and stuff like that. They're all targeting against that exact test data. We don't do any delete to existing test data. We do have some more experimental tests in our suite that do, or which we call scenarios, which are meant to be a little bit more realistic in that, like for example, a customer creates a new issue. But that again is in its own bubble, and to put it that way, it'll go off and create its own project. It'll go create its own kind of situation, create the issue, and then it'll delete that after the fact. But it will never delete any existing data. No.
So what I'm hearing is that you could run it against a production instance, so long as it's not being used, basically, if that makes sense. I.e., like as a last test before go live.
Yeah, that has been done with customers. Yeah, so we don't test against our production, but for a customer that's about to go live, it would make sense to run the tool against it. We did it one customer recently where they actually ran it many times against it, while tweaking the environment, getting it to the right place, and trying to figure out issues. There turned out to be some weird issue with the cloud provider, and then that was just dramatically affecting performance. And then they ran it as their final build check, just to again ensure, even if some tests are failing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the environment's not ready. It just means that, oh, there's just a little blip there. That's fine. Don't worry about it. That's just that specific test. It's the environment itself is clearly 99% of the tests have passed. It's ready to go. Yeah. So that's a fine use case for the tool. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's me then. So the thought behind my question is basically when you see a test result, one of the things that you're always asking yourself, is this result a good result or a bad one or a midpoint? Helpful to kind of make that judgment is eventually some data to compare it against. So are we having any plans to provide, I don't know, an anonymous upload kind of database to compare your results against, or does that not make any sense? I'm just looking for some aid to understand on whether my results are good or bad results.
Yeah, no, I think you said makes complete sense. This is kind of what I was trying to describe throughout, is that this is a lab test tool. and the idea is to make it a controlled test environment. So right from the start, from how the tests are created, right through to test data, everything is designed to be controlled so we can try and get real results, realistic results, accurate results. If you run this, if you go and run this against an environment that's busy, then the results are going to be skewed. There's no point. They're dirty, for lack of a better term, because there's other processes happening, and that will obviously impact performance. So that's kind of from start to finish. That's what this tool and the idea. This is why I said at the beginning, half the battle is preparation. Is the setup. Running the tests are comparatively easy once everything's in place, but once you need to get everything you need to get your ducks in a row, so to speak. For comparison's sake, again, this is why we said we have opinionated test data, because, like say, the first thing we'll probably ask you to do is run it with our test there, so we can then compare like for like. We can compare a customer's 10K target environment to our 10K target environment. We can compare the specs, we can compare the results, and we can start debugging properly to get to the right answer why something's happened or why it's not performing as it should do.
That right there, Grant, sorry to interrupt you, is probably the biggest challenge with like a results database. It would be having that sort of objective. My environment is X, Y, Z. Like you made reference to the 10,000 user reference architecture. My environment might not be exactly the same. Does GPT make any kind of an effort to quantify the machines it's running on and like talk about like the different number of nodes and what's running on each node?
No. GPT is an external tool, so it's quite hard for it to know that, so to speak. It will tell you the version of the environment and a few other small metadata, but this is where this other aspect of the debugging I was talking about is with the monitoring after the fact, looking at the metrics, running the test, looking at the metrics, and evaluating. We go into some detail bits in the docs about how to do it best, although I think I still want to actually make that a little bit more detailed. But the idea is that you run the test and then you look at the results, look at the metrics, and then you debug like you would any other performance issue and go, okay, well, clearly, for example, this CPU here is absolutely maxed. Why is that the case? It's the search endpoints, global search hits the day was quite hard, and the team's working away, improving that all the time. But on a customer environment, you might see that much higher. And again, then it's just going through, doing the work, essentially going through the detail, trying to figure out what's what.
And I haven't put this in the doc, but it occurs while you're showing that and talking about 10K reference architecture. Have we published results from our different size reference architectures and like a desirable GPT result for like a 2K, 5K, 10K reference architecture?
It's on the screen right now.
Amazing.
We have our pipelines with GPT report the results to our wiki daily or weekly, depending on the environment. And yeah, that's essentially your benchmark to at least compare against initially. Yeah.
This is Jefferson. Sorry, I did receive feedback regarding the report. I think you kind of clarified it today, as far as this isn't something that you want to slap against production. This isn't something that you want to rely upon necessarily to move you forward. But I did receive some feedback from customers around some of the RPS metrics that came back, as far as being like super low, or it kind of shook their confidence as far as what they can use, like and mainly around the commit, like the git commits and things like that. It was like 4, I think, RPS, I think, really low, and that was troubling to some. But I didn't know if there's future work going on where we can actually do more, kind of what Jamie was suggesting, slap it against production actually, and really get a good feel of where it should be. Because I feel we get a lot of the times customers are asking for best practices, or asking for VM size, or asking for these types of things, and we don't necessarily take an opinionated approach on that, and especially around troubleshooting. Like if a CPU is launching for a particular service or server, it's hard to go, okay, so I have 80 terabytes of Git data, and I'm going to be uploading it. My pipelines are small, but I still have huge amounts of data that I'm committing to. How am I supposed to best architect GitLab in order to handle that type of situation? Because currently today we're just using users as that measure rather than actual workload.
It's very difficult, is the answer.
Yeah.
The problem is that, as I kind of alluded to, the GPT is designed to be a line in the sand, and that is subjective by its nature. We'll always have, at one point we had to decide, okay, here's the line in the sand that we're drawing. There will be outliers on both sides, sometimes extreme outliers on both sides. We have run GPT against heavier test data, and we didn't see any major differences in terms of performance, which gave us some confidence in that regard. But there will be customers out there with substantially large repos, as you say, repos that we just can't actually get our hands on. We test against Linux, which is the largest public repo you can get your hands on today, but that is still tiny compared to some private repos out there. So there will always be outliers, and what we're trying to do is minimize the impact, but sometimes there will be an impact to support where they have to go through and debug either a large repo or a repo that has data that's very heavily skewed. You might have an environment that's running pipelines constantly, for example, with a small repo, or vice versa. There's so many different factors that can impact performance. And as I say, we are continuing to try and expand where we can, but it'll always be a place in the middle, so to speak. So we can't always cover the edge cases, but we'll try and get there as best we can. When it comes to that customer of the RPS thing, are you talking about the RPS that's being tested with, or the actual RPS result?
So that's a good question. I was mainly referring to the result. So the Git
that's fine.
RPS was for, and I asked it in the channel about that within the group, and they had stated that, oh, we don't really have a good I guess test load for the Gits, right? We can only use our test users that we've created in order to perform those actions, but nothing, from my understanding, nothing automated as far as where you could just really crank up or turn a knob or a dial, right, to increase the load on Git commits within the GPT tool to get better results or higher results.
We can do some limited things with that. On the screen now is a Git push test I just ran there, which is doing pushes of some commits at a rate of 20 requests per second.
Okay.
There is another scenario we just created recently, which is a user creates a new commit through the API. All this is done through HTTP though. Doing it through Git with SSH is we've literally not found a tool we can do it with. It doesn't seem to be possible. So all the tests are done through HTTP. As I said in the slides, we do test Git and web at a lower throughput. Just to people who may see for the first time, you might think it's actually quite substantially lower throughput, but that's actually based on real test data, real metrics in the real world. From the data that we've got our hands on, at least, I'm always happy to look at more data. But we always found that Git and web are actually quite lower than API. But again, we test all of our endpoints with considerable headroom. It's a rule that I follow. Performance is take what you see in the real world, double it, and then double it again. And you probably still aren't there yet, but that's probably a good start. So we sometimes get feedback like, wow, your RPS is way too high compared to anything we see. And then the answer is, well, we need headroom, and it's better to be higher than lower. Better be safe than sorry. So if you still have problems with that, give me a shout. We can help you through that. Our RPSs are locked in that regard. You pass through the RPS, which is the top RPS, which is for API, and then the tool will calculate a 10% rate for Git. So you can use that. And if you're looking for a very specific RPS, that's something that can help guide you through the tool.
Awesome. Thanks, Grant. Really appreciate the feedback and information.
No problem at all.
I think Yolanda's next.
I was just curious if the tool works on any version that's spun up.
That's a good question. Officially, we will support back to 12.5. We can support before that, but that's a bit more of a hand-holding situation. The main reason is importing data is been quite bumpy with older versions. Specifically, I think on 12.3.4, we found just it didn't work. I think there's actual product issues at that time. On older versions, it's up to 12.0, down to 12.0 even. Again, it should be fine, but we might need to handhold and guide the customer or the user or yourself through that. For 11x, that's very much a custom situation, and that would need to be kind of tackled bespokely, so to speak. But 12.5 up, everything should just work.
Okay.
Touch wood. But again, we have actually found that more import issues over the last month. We're beholding, unfortunately, to how good import is, and in the last few releases, there has been some issues as well. So if you're having any problems, then again, it's just a reach out and we can try and guide you through it.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing to call out of that actually is the thresholds. We're still not sure of the best way to tackle thresholds for previous versions. The thresholds that you'll see in the test results, like the one on screen, has a 5,000 TTFB threshold. That might get reduced in the future as the endpoint improves. So you might run the test today with the latest version of the tool and they might report failures, but those failures actually are still correct for that time. That endpoint was just slower in 12.8, for example, it's just substantially slower, but the tool will report it as a failure. Again, that's just a quick question to us or whoever, just to confirm that we want to tackle that in the future to be better and actually be able to intelligently say, but that's quite difficult. So we're still trying to figure out the best way to do that.
All right, Simon, I think for the purposes of this call, we'll go ahead and skip that question. There's some great discussion in the notes doc. So that brings us to John.
Yeah, Grant, can the performance tool be configured to test the limits of a machine where it keeps scaling up until it like breaks the machine, and then we can say, here's the max number of users that this setup can support?
We provide out-of-the-box option files, which, as the slide said, GPT is based on Case 6, which is a well-regarded industry open source performance testing tool. We provide various option files just to kind of help make that experience easier. But GPT, and by its nature Case 6, can be used to do more complex scenarios. Our scenarios are pretty straightforward. It's spin up to, for example, 10K, it's spin up to 200 users over the first 5 seconds, maintain that for the next 55, and then spin it down. With a little bit of K6 knowledge, which shouldn't take too long to learn up on, you can easily take one of those files and adjust them to say, actually, sort of 200 users over the first 5 seconds, and then spin out to 1,000 over the next 5 minutes, if you so wanted, and so on. So the tool can be used for that. Yeah, it's a custom scenario.
No, add a slight spin on that. So obviously the options files are there for sort of validated 1K reference, 2K reference users, etc. Could you set the tool so that actually what it does is it starts off with the 1K reference and runs that for however long it takes. So I think it's about an hour it takes. Then does the 2K and basically it carries on going through the ops until it gets to one that fails. Because I know that there is ultimately there's a pass fail at the end of it. So. I mean, we're talking probably an overnight, like 8 hours, 10 hours plus run here, probably. But yeah.
And that might need to happen sometimes. That's more of not a soak test, but yeah. Not in the tool itself, but it would be not too hard to script.
Yeah, it'd be basically just run it once, run it twice.
You run it once,
going.
And then you obviously get the script to exit, or you could bash script it, for example. You get that script to exit the first time the tool will report a failure. So it's not impossible to do that kind of thing, yeah.
Because I was just thinking that that would then come back with a result with like, yeah, 1K users passed, 2K users passed, 5K users passed, 10K users failed. And then at least you can say to the customer, look, we've tested it up to this point fairly easily.
That should be quite scriptable to do. The output will be quite heavy, but as
long
as
you're saving it. Don't get me wrong, the server might melt, but you know.
As long as you're saving the output and you can go back and review it and you can see how it's done for each kind of thing. You can easily automate that in GitLab CI as well, where you can just have one stage for each throughput. So there's various ways to kind of tackle that, yeah, but not natively in the tool.
The reason why I asked that in particular is I've got customers that say, you know, they have massively over provisioned their infrastructure for the number of users that they are having. So they may have like 300 users, but the architecture they've got should probably support 1,000,
more,
2,000 plus. And I guess, you know, they don't want to test for 300 users because they know full well it's going to succeed for 300 users. I guess what they really want to know is at what point are they going to start needing to relook at their infrastructure?
It's a fair question. Yeah. So yeah, the best thing to do would be to script that with either GitLab CI or through a script, bash script, or some other script. You could, if you did that inside the tool, which you could do, you can create a scenario where you could say go to 1,000 users, then go to 2, go to 3. The underlying tool key 6 will report the summary of that, and that's the only issue there. So you probably will just, every test will fail because it'll give you the summary of the 90th percentile and the average. So
you really need to run it in as a whole and then stop and then run it as a whole.
To get the full results for each kind of threshold for each target, you want to run the tool separately for that. Yeah.
Okay.
That can be used for that scenario for sure. Yeah, to give them that data. That's not a bad idea.
Grant, how open are you to helping us interpret the results of the GPT run against customer data? With all the considerations about, we would like a clean set of data using our basic test data. As part of our proposed TAM health check, I think customers are going to want to run this against their existing data. Would you be open to helping us interpret the results if that was the case?
No, absolutely, yeah. But
Cool.
If it's hard to debug without our baseline. I'm always happy, and Nalia, my co-worker, is always happy to look at data results, but then by its nature, performance testing is quite large and quite wide, and so the results you get are quite high level. So you'll see that merge requests, listing merge requests is direly bad, but then we don't have full transparency of the data to actually see why is that the case. They've got 10,000 more merge requests in our test data. Is that just the only reason, or is it also because the environment is slower? So again, there's two factors there, and that muddies the waters. So this is why we need our base data. So if we usually we'd ask for both. If it's definitely not possible, we'll try and give a look and give our best guesses. But then, as I say, we're impeded in terms of being able to give a full analysis.
And that's fair, and that might be sufficient because we want the TAM health check to be a much more lighter experience than a professional services health check, which would probably run against a clean server with all that test data already implemented. So that might be sufficient for us.
That's fine. It's just calling out the caveats. We're always open to looking at it though. That's not a problem.
Yeah, I think the caveats are what's important here for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem at all.
Any other questions?
You can ask me about the reference architectures as well if you're wanting to ask about those.
Oh, okay. I've got one. When are the reference architectures going to be updated to include Gitly cluster?
Yeah. When it's
he didn't.
It's a fair
I'm
question.
gonna run away.
I get asked that a lot. Unfortunately, cluster's still not performing as well as we want it to. It's performing pretty badly in terms of prefect specifically. Uses the database very, very heavily. We've had some improvements on that recently. Before it was infinite, as best I could tell. The database CPU hits for prefects against its database was infinity. It was just absolutely obliterating it. The cluster team immediately tried to look at fixing that, and they did. And now it's about maybe 4 times specs-wise compared to the GitLab database specs. So that's still bad, but it's something. So if you have a customer that's really, really, really needing it now, then you can give them that data. But hopefully in 13.4, they'll get that done further.
So just to reiterate, the database part of the HA configuration is the bit that needs to be over provisioned 4x roughly by comparison.
Yeah. So the problem is that we want the clusters to we didn't want updating reference architectures is difficult. Every update impacts every customer potentially, so we need to always be careful about it. And we didn't want to put cluster in until it was definitely ready, and in the configuration we wanted as well. The big win with cluster that we didn't have before, which is a massive pain point, is that with the generator, if you go off and run it to import data, we will describe in documentation, you need to import the same GitLab large project, into every Gitly node because they're separate and there is no concurrency or anything else there. And that's a big pain point for us. With cluster, that goes away. You have one GitLab copy, Gitly copy, so to speak, and that's transplanted across multiple cluster nodes in the cluster. And then the real winner there is the idea of distributed reads, which allows obviously GitLab to then speak to the standbys as well as the main primary, and that improves performance greatly. So that's the thing we really wanted in with the reference architectures, because that will reduce costs, it will reduce complexity, it ticks every box. It's a massive win. But with that feature on is when Prefect really hits this database too hard. And as I say, we raised the issue literally last week. The cluster team working on 13.4. I'm very much hoping we'll have it in soon, but we want to do it right, because we get in too early, and then customers go off and buy hardware that's like massively bigger, and then a month later say, actually, you don't need that hardware anymore. They're not going to be happy. So yeah, but it's not a closed door in that one. If a customer comes in really wanting it, that's just a conversation to have with either us or the self-managed environment triage working group. Postgres 12 is the other one as well. We're hoping to get that in as well soon. So yeah, it's a fun old lark.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Grant and Nalia, for joining us today. Great session. Join us next time. We may or may not be having a session next week, so stay tuned, and we will see you all soon.